federating data with FHIR. So this is really cool, this presentation, because what Nikolai said that he wanted me to do was to tell you about all the problems, but I don't have to solve any of them. I just have to introduce the challenges. That's exactly the kind of talk that I like the most. I can just make it all, tell you all your problems, and then go, see, I've done my job. So I'm going to talk about combining data records and combining access points. They're two different aspects of federation, and they kind of crop up ubiquitously across the ecosystem. And as I said, I'm just going to tell you about the problems. So let's start with a simple case. On the left side, you've got a bunch of sources. The sources, for the purposes of this discussion, the sources are running FHIR, but actually most of the problems aren't really related to FHIR. They're related to the underlying data patterns, and so it doesn't really matter. But we're gonna. I'm the father of FHIR, so we're going to talk about FHIR. And then you've got some code that you wrote, because you're suckers, that actually takes data from all these and sticks them in a single patient-specific data repository. And it doesn't have to be patient-specific, institution, national, hey, it doesn't matter what it is. You're combining data. This is a generic thing that we all do. So this is the kind of things you deal with. You've got to get access to the data. You've got to migrate the data. You've got to deal with synchronization issues, do terminology munging, reconciling records, dealing with patient merge, and consent and privacy issues. Yeah, some of my slides go a little bit with details, but I'm not necessarily going to talk to them because I'm only talking to the problems. But you've got to find the server API, which means somebody's got to give you an endpoint. And is there a national registry of endpoints? I am not aware today of any national endpoint registries that are live. I know of work towards them in several countries, but I'm not aware of any. So you've got to find out the endpoints somehow, which is painful. Somebody's got to give them to you. Then you have to get tokens one way or another. Hopefully they're all running smart on FHIR, or at least OAuth or something. Or maybe you're going to have some complicated national security system that's ultra secure, and the primary reason it's ultra secure is because it's impossible to use. And then you get your security tokens. And then you're going to access a patient record or some records, and you're going to have to pick the right patient. In some systems, that sort of happens in the background through OAuth, or as your patient picks a matching record. Others, you have to make the match by national identifier because you've got a nice, reliable national identifier. And even in the countries that have a nice national identifier, I've heard from users who can't use it for policy or technical reasons. So that's the first set of challenges. Then you have to migrate data. Somehow you've got to merge it all into something with unique IDs one way or another. There's multiple approaches for this, and so I'll come back to this. Then you have to update all the references in the data and the extensions and the narrative to point to the new IDs or the munged IDs. That's actually the easiest part of the entire presentation, because the open source implementations have code for doing that, for iterating the resource and updating the references. That part's the easy part. And then you have to resolve differences in profiles, in content. Data might be present in some systems and absent in others. Because going back, I didn't talk about this. And the thing that really blows your mind here is that actually it's reasonably likely that these sources are talking to each other or talking to third-party systems. And so they're all overlapping data sets. That's one of the big problems that you have. But some of them have some data and some have others. They have granularity differences. For instance, one's got a phone number, which is a home phone number on another system, and a work phone number on another. You got to deal with stuff like that as granularities come and gone across the systems. And then the systems could well be making conflicting claims about profiles that data conforms to. Do they, don't they? It's a nightmare. So you got to navigate that stuff. Then once you're getting the records, you've got to keep them synchronized. You can get them once and say done. I won the match. The match is the World Cup's over. Or you can say, actually, no, I need to keep fetching the records and keep them up to date. And mostly that's what you need to do. No matter how you get them, the real question that you have to worry about is the boundaries of what you're fetching. What records are patient specific? What records are system specific? There's linked records like provenance and audit trails. There's all the admin support like practitioners and organizations, and some configuration value sets and so forth. If you're building a PHR, a patient-specific registry, are those patient-specific? Does the patient care about them? How do you handle them? And are they the same if you get them from different patient records, but they're the same IDs? But the real big problem is resources that go missing for some reason. You are synchronizing from a source and the source is unavailable, or some of the data in the source is unavailable. What do you do with the data that you have that you can't confirm? Maybe it got too old. 5 years is not an unusual limit, or the server moved it from the active list to saying sending active meds. Do you keep the record? It was reassigned to a different patient, but you can't see that anymore. And there's maybe the security and privacy changed on the source consent management. There's a lot of safety problems here in practice, and I actually wrote on them before. And this is a whole area of challenge with the resources that go missing. And of course, different systems use different clinical technologies. Around the world, I see increasing national alignment on key clinical concepts, but there's always the smaller code sets that are all over the place, awards and clinical teams and things like that, different status codes for depending on how the system thinks about how much it cares about the process of the data versus the outcomes. Some of those things might matter for record matching, because we have some useful infrastructure for that, but still, what a nightmare. Then you've got to reconcile the records. I got 2 resources from different sources in the problem list for the patient. Are they the same problem? How do I decide if they're the same problem? And then if they are the same problem, should I merge them or just mark one as a duplicate of the other? And then how does that ripple forward into my data analysis, my presentation based off the system? And what do I do with the context of the author if they differ? Because they probably do, because they've been copied from system to system and mangled a bit as they have. And maybe there's a human reconciliation process where the humans look at the problems and go, how these 2 problems are actually the same problems, so I'll merge them. How do you handle that? It's a good thing for me that I'm not solving these problems. I'm just telling you about them. And then there's the nightmare called patient merge. I always know when I'm dealing with someone who is not familiar with healthcare, because I say to them, so what are you doing a patient merge? And they look at me blankly and go, patient what? I go, you haven't done healthcare before. But when you have, they just roll their eyes and goes, yeah. So how do you merge if you find you have 2 records for the same patient? It's not only in healthcare that this comes up, but it's, as far as I can tell, a healthcare concept, because other banks, airlines, whatever, don't care. You have separate records, it's your problem. So do you link the patient records and mark both to say these are actually the same patient, or do you actually try and collate the record down to a single record, which we call merge? And then you find out you did it wrong and you have to unmerge, and then what happens? And there's probably 5 or 6 approaches you can do to this. And I've seen all 5 or 6 in production. Actually, there's probably more, but I just haven't seen them yet. So, but how does that manifest on the API? If you do a patient record on a merged patient, get patient B, because they've been merged to A, do you get a 200 response with the patient A, or do you get a 3 or 4 redirect to patient A? both. There are systems live doing both things, and there's other approaches as well. And there are systems doing all the possible approaches. What does it mean if you do a search for observations on subject patient B? Now the patient B no longer exists. Do you get no records? Maybe an operation outcome saying, maybe you should look at patient A. Or do you just get all the records for patient A? We got systems doing both of those as well. And yes, again, lots of unsafe things going on here. These are hard. And then there's consent, privacy. And I tell you, looking around the world, what I see is that consent and privacy are applied as a gatekeeper thing on a repository. You agree to put your data in a repository under a particular policy, and so it goes in the policy, and so all the data in the repository is under the single policy. And then people can access the set of data under the single policy. But now there's systems coming that actually ripple the operating consent agreements and privacy agreements into the database, into the repository. So when you access the repository, you're accessing a variety of data with a variety of permissions, and the data access is responsible for enforcing the access to the availability of data. It's much more complicated, much more risky, much more useful. I think that research in this area is the real frontier of healthcare data knowledge right now. I was talking to Thomas Beale about this back in Baltimore, and we think that this is going to be, now that we're getting more and more data sharing, data interoperability, actually traveling consent agreements is going to be a real huge challenge. Now, one more thing, just very quickly, is a white paper I'm working on right now. FHIR is a very flexible API. That's both a strength and a weakness. Managing endpoints, lots of endpoints, huge challenge. Would be real good is to be able to say, we're going to throw an intermediary server, a Facade, in the middle. And the client will just connect to the Facade, and the Facade will connect to all the servers. And the servers and the client don't even need to know about it. And then you can decide how many intermediaries you want and what you want them to do without having to redesign clients or servers. That'd be really cool. So what would you need to do? And so here's the model. Your client here talks to an intermediary, which talks to a whole bunch of source servers, and the client doesn't know anything about it, and the source servers don't know anything about it. It's just accessing data. And there's a link on the slides, which I assume Nikolai will distribute, to where I'm working on this on the Confluence, HL7 Confluence. The idea, I'll come back to that. So you've got to authenticate the user, you've got to combine search results, you've got to manage search synchronization, you've got to route follow-up queries to connect to the correct server. So the client only authenticates to the common server. That automatically assumes you in the scheme that the Facade and the source servers have some kind of common user auth framework. But the key is that the Facade server has to tell the source server who the user is, because there's some things that are only able to be done on the source server. The Facade server doesn't know enough to do it. I'm not going to go into the details, but the right way to do this, and I think we should start moving to this, is to say that part of the OAuth is to take a backend, to provide backend services, and take an OpenID Connect token as part of the backend services, so that the server can pass the user identity through without having to re-authenticate the user, and then the source server trusts the Facade server. And what happens is you do a search. This is how you usually start the sequence. You do a search. The Facade server sends that to all of the source servers. They all respond to the search, and the Facade server kind of merges the searches together, sorts them, deletes duplicates. We already talked about deletion of duplicates. Now imagine doing that on the fly in a search record set. Sounds like fun. But what happens when the user goes, well, what about the next page? That turns into a nightmare. All I'll say at the moment is you've probably got enough records, just tell the user you can't get more than 100 or whatever, something like that. But the real challenge is if a server doesn't respond, you wait 5, 10 seconds, and you go, too late, and I'm just going to send the user what I've got. From the user's point of view, some results are dropping in and out, they're not available. It's really important for the user to be shown by the client messages from the server to tell them what's going on. You might get a message like this. And so all of us should say, it's routine for a client to scan for operation outcomes and search results and show them to the user somehow. It's a safety thing, and it gives a lot more flexibility to the backend systems if you do that. Then somehow you want to manage resource identity. You got to do that. I talked about this, mentioned this earlier, and there's various ways to do it. Give a new ID, prefix an ID using microservices. The details are in the white paper. They're all pros and cons. Everybody fights wildly about the pros and cons because they're non-functional requirements. You got to pick one. IAG are interested in picking one and standardizing it and telling national authorities this is the way to do it. If you're interested in that, keep an eye on the Gemini IAG process, where this will manifest as an IAG specification. I think maybe you can restrict some searches to only some servers. Do you allow references between servers from the client because it doesn't know what it's doing? It's just referring to data. What if the client posts a new record? Where does it go? So there's lots of issues for doing that. And I'm going to stop and say you've got many challenges in your lives. These are all ubiquitous functions to some degree. That would be good if we share community treasure and build up common knowledge around this, because it's a huge challenge. And that is the set of problems I wanted to tell you about. Good luck.
Okay, so we have like 5 minutes for questions. So my question, Grahame, do you consider the idea of unique ID for each resource bad or not? Let's say, because this is essentially, you said that servers can intercommunicate, so data can go in circle. And potentially it can be assigned some unique ID plus some signature, something like NFT, like Web 3.0.
Well, I mean, it's a good idea, but so's world peace. It's just not going to happen. And so strategies to deal with the fact that it's not going to happen. And so honestly, my preference is for the Facade server to ignore everybody else's, well, hide everyone else's IDs and use its own unique ID and just switch them in and out as resources go backwards and forwards, and present to the client the genuine fantasy that there is only one ID for each resource. That's my recommendation. But people fight about this, but yeah, it's a big problem.
Another question is how much can we leverage experience and lessons learned from HIE?
So look, in general, of course we should leverage experience and lessons learned. But what I found looking through those, talking to people, is that you can learn the problems. That's the easiest thing to learn. And in fact, the list I gave you is problems from that kind of experience, among other things. The solutions are not necessarily good or applicable. Sometimes they're constrained to what they could do to solve the problem they had in the technology they had, and that's not a best or even possible solution in a different technology or in FHIR or something. But that doesn't mean that you don't listen, because most of the problems are underlying data problems, not FHIR API surface issues. Probably the ID issue is the surface issue. The rest is underlying data issues. And it's certainly, if you are trying to build an integrated data system, and HIs have already explored the particular space with these particular data sources, they'll give you a long list of things they shot themselves in the head with. And it's totally worth listening to them in specific and also in general.
Thank you. Gina? Hi.
Yeah, just since you'd mentioned rewriting IDs, I thought I would ask about digital signing and tamper evidence and things like that, that if you start modifying data, you no longer have any. We're just discussing problems. We don't need solutions. That's the
I do
context
not-
we're in. But
Yeah, I understand. So I do not believe in tamper-proof digital content in the context of training systems like this. There's just too many reasons you need to manipulate the data. IDs is just the beginning of the story. And to try and, reconcile what's going on, you're going to have to manipulate the data, and that will blow signatures. Signatures belong on static content that nobody can touch and nobody can do anything with.
But you can make a chain.
Oh, you sure? Make it, there's sorts of things you can do, but nobody can interpret the chain other than a human user. And look, a good audit trail is actually a better solution than digital, which is if you trust the ecosystem. And if you don't trust the ecosystem, I'll stop there. None of this is easy, right? And I had one person tell me that nobody has. We have a standing request in the standard. Tell us if you're doing digital signatures in a trading environment situation rather than a frozen content situation, and nobody has come forward and said, yeah, we're doing it, let alone, yeah, we've solved it.
Thank you. And we have a question from Vasil.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the unique ID and what I think helps with federated resources, and especially the ability to know that resource A from server A is the same as resource C from server B, is the use of dot identifier. So unique identifiers that can cut across the different services, and that requires the ability to store unlimited number of identifiers per resource. And if you have that, then there is one hint that can help in that area.
Yeah, I know there's a bunch of other like tail requirements around actually having the same modularity of stored records and granularity, and actually remembering to store the IDs and managing merges, correct? It's a bit of, that is the place. But my experience is people munge identifiers all the time because they take, I mentioned world peace for a reason, because people look at it, it's my problem, my space, my solution. I don't care about anybody else. And that leads to all the conflict. And I would always recommend, and always do, extremely conservative identifier management. But of course, engineers with functional requirements go, nah. That's my experience.
Okay, guys, we have 1 minute for one more question. I know one successful implementation of this. It's a Git for source control.
Okay. Well, I mean, okay.
Yeah, if you imagine the patient record is a one repo, then everybody can clone it and merge with stuff. Something like this. I think that's the future.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Okay.